A White House dinner, 1970s. Every guest at the table gets a glass of cheap $5 wine.
But the president's glass is different. His bottle is wrapped in a white napkin, so nobody can read the label.
Inside it, a top-shelf French Bordeaux worth 10 times what everyone else is drinking. The president is Richard Nixon, and he does this at every single state dinner. From smuggled wine barrels to a red button that summons Diet Coke, the drinking habits of American presidents are stranger than you would ever guess. This is History Lens. Let me take you through the whole list, starting from the very beginning. George Washington is often remembered as a stiff, dignified founding father, but the reality is far more interesting. His favorite drink was Madeira wine, a sweet, fortified wine from the Portuguese island of Madeira that was wildly popular among the colonial elite. Washington did not just enjoy it casually either. He imported it by the barrel, sometimes ordering over 100 gallons at a time. When the British imposed heavy taxes on Madeira, Washington did not stop buying it. He simply started smuggling it instead, routing shipments through intermediaries to dodge the tariffs. But here is the part most people never hear about. After his presidency, Washington built a full-scale whiskey distillery at Mount Vernon that by 1799 was producing nearly 11,000 gallons of rye whiskey per year, making it one of the largest distilleries in the entire country. The father of the nation was also, quite literally, one of America's biggest liquor producers. John Adams took a completely different approach to his mornings than most people would consider reasonable. He started virtually every single day with a glass of hard cider, and by hard, we mean fully alcoholic, brewed from fermented apples. Adams swore this daily ritual kept him healthy, sharp, and ready to argue with anyone in Congress by lunchtime, which he apparently did with great enthusiasm. But Adams also had political principles when it came to his drinking. After the Boston Tea Party, he and his wife Abigail gave up tea entirely, viewing it as unpatriotic, and switched to coffee as what they considered the proper drink of a free American. Adams lived to 90, which for the 18th century was almost supernatural, so maybe the hard cider was doing something right after all. Thomas Jefferson approached alcohol like he approached everything else, with the intensity of a scholar and the budget of a man who did not care about going into debt. His favorite drink was wine, specifically the fine European vintages he discovered during his years as American minister to France. While most Americans at the time were drinking rum, whiskey, and rough colonial Madeira, Jefferson was touring vineyards in Bordeaux, Burgundy, and the Rhone Valley, taking meticulous notes on every bottle he tasted, recording flavor, color, acidity, and his personal ranking. He is sometimes called America's first true wine connoisseur, and his influence extended beyond personal taste, because he spent years trying to convince his fellow Americans that wine was a civilized alternative to the hard liquor that dominated the young republic. James Madison, standing at 5 feet 4 inches and weighing roughly 100 pounds, had a very practical reason for avoiding heavy drinking. At his size, even a single glass of whiskey could knock him sideways, so he mostly stuck to coffee and tea, occasionally sipping champagne at formal events, but never pushing his limits. His successor, James Monroe, however, had no such restraint. Monroe developed a serious taste for Bordeaux and champagne during his own time as a diplomat in France, and after becoming president, he turned the White House into what amounted to a personal import operation, shipping in well over 1,000 bottles of French wine during his administration. John Quincy Adams inherited his father's love of Madeira, but took it to an entirely different level, in what might be the most impressive party trick in presidential history. Adams once participated in a blind taste test where he correctly identified 11 out of 14 different Madeira wines by flavor alone, a feat that would challenge even professional sommeliers today. The man had a palate that bordered on superhuman, which is remarkable given that he spent most of his waking hours engaged in bitter political arguments rather than wine appreciation.
Andrew Jackson's relationship with whiskey was less about refinement and more about raw force. Jackson loved whiskey the way he loved everything else, intensely and without apology. But it was his 1829 inauguration that became the stuff of legend.
After the ceremony, Jackson invited the public to celebrate at the White House, and roughly 20,000 supporters poured in. What followed was essentially a riot fueled by whiskey punch. Guests smashed china, tore down curtains, stood on furniture with muddy boots, and crushed against one another so violently that Jackson himself had to be shielded against a wall and eventually evacuated back to his hotel. The only way staff managed to clear the building was by dragging large tubs of whiskey punch out onto the front lawn to lure the mob outside. Martin Van Buren earned the nickname Blue Whiskey Van for his legendary ability to drink glass after glass without showing any visible effect, a skill that served him well in the rough-and-tumble politics of the 1830s. But Van Buren's confidence may have gotten the better of him, because in the 1840 campaign, he mocked his opponent, William Henry Harrison, as an out-of-touch general who would be happy living in a log cabin with a barrel of hard cider. Harrison's team turned that insult into the most brilliant campaign strategy of the era, launching the log cabin and hard cider campaign that positioned Harrison as a common man's candidate and ultimately won him the presidency. After Harrison died, just 31 days into office, John Tyler stepped into the presidency with a preference for French champagne and hosted White House parties filled with music, dancing, and flowing bottles. But the party atmosphere came to an abrupt end when James K. Polk took office and promptly banned all hard liquor from the White House. Polk was all business, and his wife Sarah enforced the dry policy so strictly that Washington insiders nicknamed her Sahara Sarah because her receptions were drier than a desert. Polk himself preferred coffee, and plenty of it. Zachary Taylor's favorite drink might be the most tragically ironic in presidential history. Taylor was not much of an alcohol drinker and preferred cold milk, a seemingly healthy choice. But on a scorching 4th of July in 1850, Taylor cooled himself down with a bowl of iced milk and fresh cherries. The cherries had been washed in contaminated Washington water, and within hours, Taylor was violently ill. 5 days later, he was dead, a man who had survived multiple battlefield wounds, only to be taken down by dairy and fruit. Millard Fillmore kept things simple with water and tea, leaving little mark on White House drinking culture. Franklin Pierce, however, left a very different kind of mark. Pierce leaned heavily on alcohol after the devastating loss of his young son in a train accident shortly before his inauguration, and the tragedy sent him into a depression that deepened after his wife Jane also passed away. He reportedly once told a friend that the only thing an ex-president could do was get drunk, and sadly, Pierce died of liver disease caused by alcoholism. James Buchanan, like Washington before him, was devoted to Madeira wine, so much so that as a young student assigned a navigation project, he chose to sail to the island of Madeira itself. Abraham Lincoln stood out as one of the most sober presidents in an era when heavy drinking was essentially a political requirement. At dinners where everyone else raised glasses of wine, Lincoln would quietly reach for water, coffee, or milk. What most people do not know is that Lincoln actually worked as a bartender earlier in his life, selling apple brandy at a general store in Illinois before entering politics. He understood alcohol perfectly well and simply chose not to drink it. But his vice president, Andrew Johnson, did not share that restraint. On Inauguration Day in March 1865, Johnson arrived already nursing a hangover and decided the cure was more whiskey. After 3 tumblers, he stumbled onto the stage and delivered a slurred, rambling speech that humiliated himself in front of Congress, the Supreme Court, and Lincoln himself. Ulysses S. Grant's favorite whiskey was Old Crow, and his drinking habits became one of the most famous stories of the Civil War. After Grant won a string of decisive battles, Lincoln allegedly said to find out what whiskey Grant drinks and send a barrel to every other general. A line that may be apocryphal, but perfectly captures the era's attitude toward alcohol and military success. When Rutherford B. Hayes succeeded Grant, the White House went completely dry, not because of Hayes himself, but because of his wife, Lucy, a devout temperance advocate who banned all alcohol from official functions and earned the nickname Lemonade Lucy. Guests at White House events found themselves drinking lemonade and water where whiskey and wine had once flowed freely. James Garfield quietly lifted the alcohol ban when he took office, ensuring beer was back on tap at White House gatherings. Chester Arthur went further, maintaining a bar cart that rivaled fine restaurants with wines, liqueurs, and whiskey highballs, earning him the nickname Elegant Arthur. Grover Cleveland swung hard in the opposite direction. Cleveland loved beer and loved the saloons where it was served. He and a friend once agreed to limit themselves to 4 beers a day, but when that rule collapsed after roughly 2 evenings, they quietly revised it to 4 tankers a day instead, which gives you a sense of how seriously Cleveland took self-imposed limits. Benjamin Harrison preferred tea served hot and proper, a notably restrained choice for the era. William McKinley inspired bartenders to create McKinley's Delight, a potent blend of rye whiskey, sweet vermouth, cherry brandy, and a splash of absinthe. A cocktail strong enough to influence foreign policy. Theodore Roosevelt grew fresh mint in the White House garden to make his own mint juleps, crushed with sugar and mixed with Kentucky bourbon. William Howard Taft's drink of choice was ginger ale, and during a visit to Savannah in 1909, he reportedly drank 4 bottles at a single lunch. Woodrow Wilson led the nation into Prohibition while quietly enjoying his own Scotch whiskey on the side, and when he left office, he needed special congressional approval to transport his personal liquor collection to his new home. Since moving, alcohol was technically illegal under the law he had helped enforce. Warren Harding took the hypocrisy even further, hosting weekly poker nights in the White House during Prohibition, where bootleg whiskey flowed freely. His liquor reportedly came from confiscated stock seized during Prohibition raids, meaning the president was literally drinking evidence. Calvin Coolidge publicly kept the White House dry, but privately sipped Tokay wine on occasion. Herbert Hoover discovered an elegant loophole, since foreign embassies were technically sovereign territory where American law did not apply. Hoover reportedly made regular visits to the Belgian Embassy during Prohibition to enjoy his evening martinis, perfectly legal as long as he was standing on Belgian soil. Once Prohibition ended and he left office, Hoover made up for lost time with a nightly ritual of 2 extremely dry gin martinis. Franklin Roosevelt was famous for his dirty martinis, which he insisted on mixing himself. At the 1943 Tehran Conference, FDR actually played bartender for Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. Churchill loved the drink, but Stalin reportedly took 1 sip and said it was cold on the stomach, which was likely diplomatic language for something far less polite. Harry Truman started every morning with what he called an eye-opener, a shot of bourbon mixed into his orange juice, a wake-up routine that makes modern coffee culture look tame by comparison. Dwight Eisenhower preferred Scotch on the rocks, no frills. John F. Kennedy appreciated a good Bloody Mary, particularly during his weekend brunches at Hyannis Port, and he also developed a taste for Heineken, one of the first European beers to gain serious popularity in America. Lyndon Johnson drank Scotch and soda Texas style, with a big glass, lots of ice, and endless refills, often while cruising around his ranch with a tumbler in one hand and the steering wheel in the other. Richard Nixon's wine habit produced what might be the pettiest presidential drinking story ever told. At White House state dinners, guests were served affordable $5 bottles of California wine, while Nixon's personal glass was poured from a far more expensive French Bordeaux. To make sure nobody noticed, he had waiters wrap his bottle in a white napkin to conceal the label. The man who would later lie about Watergate apparently started by lying about his wine. Gerald Ford's go-to was a double martini, understandable given that he inherited the Watergate mess. Jimmy Carter ran one of the driest White Houses since Prohibition, not for political reasons, but personal ones. As he came from a family that had struggled with alcoholism and mostly stuck to water, iced tea, and milk, Ronald Reagan brought California wine back to the White House with Hollywood flair and essentially became an unofficial ambassador for Napa Valley. George H.W. Bush enjoyed a vodka martini and the occasional baseball game beer. Bill Clinton picked up a taste for the snakebite, a 50-50 mix of lager and hard cider during his Oxford student days, and never quite let it go. Though his daily habits leaned more toward Diet Coke and iced tea. George W. Bush was a dedicated follower of what he once called the 4 Bs: beer, bourbon, B&B liqueur, and black velvet whiskey. But at age 40, he quit drinking entirely and never went back, switching to Coke Zero and non-alcoholic beer for the rest of his life. Barack Obama was the rare president who looked completely natural with a pint in his hand, whether at a Dublin pub on St. Patrick's Day or a backyard cookout in Washington. But Obama went beyond just drinking beer. Under his direction, the White House kitchen created the first ever presidential homebrew, a honey ale made with honey harvested directly from Michelle Obama's South Lawn beehives, making him the first president to literally brew beer in the White House. Donald Trump has never touched alcohol in his entire life, but that does not mean he lacks a beverage obsession. Trump reportedly drinks as many as 12 cans of Diet Coke per day, and during both his first and second terms. He installed a red button on the Oval Office desk that summons White House staff to deliver a fresh can. He reportedly enjoyed pranking visitors by pressing the button and watching them tense up, thinking it might be something far more serious than a soda delivery. Joe Biden also does not drink alcohol, but his beverage of choice is orange Gatorade, which his staff stocked in every room to keep him hydrated and energized throughout the day. What makes this whole story fascinating is not just the drinks themselves, but what they reveal about the people who held the most powerful office in the world. Washington smuggled wine and distilled whiskey because he believed a man should enjoy what he wants without asking permission. Jackson threw the wildest party the White House has ever seen because he genuinely believed the presidency belonged to ordinary people. Nixon hid his expensive wine because even in something as trivial as a dinner, he could not resist deception. And Hoover walked to a foreign embassy just to have a cocktail because the law he publicly supported was one he had no intention of following himself. Every glass tells a story, and over 200 years of American history, the White House bar has never really been empty. Thank you for watching. This has been History Lens. If you want more stories like this, the kind that never made it into your history textbook, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss one.